Hello, my name is Rwaltr, and this is a tutorial slash presentation on how to use a backup utility called Restic, a command line based backup that uses an index and checksum instead of the traditional snapshot method. The way most backup systems work is that they use snapshots to create deltas over a period of time. This means that each snapshot represents the previous snapshots plus the data that has been changed. While at first sight, this sounds like a good idea, the problem is that over a long period of time, say a month, means that in order to make a month's worth of backup and to reference the most recent one, you have to process all of the snapshots. Restic does this differently. Instead of using deltas, it uses a chunking method. It chunks up your data into multiple smaller bits, hashes them to get a unique identity, and then stores all the chunk in the database. It then uses an index to reference these files in the orders that are required to rebuild the files. The benefit that you get is deduplication without having to reference multiple snapshots over a long period of time. If you add a new file, that file gets chunked and any new chunks are added in until those old chunks are no longer needed. Restic is entirely client-side. This means that you can use any type of remote repository, and it does not have to have a special type of computable ability. This means you can use anything like a local file system, a file system mount, S3, HTTP, or anything that rclone supports. Unlike another program called Borg, Restic allows you to upload from multiple hosts into the same repository. Restic is also a backup by default system. This means that all of your backups are going to be encrypted client side. There are keys that you can create. You can have multiple keys for the same repository, but do keep in mind that there is no permission or role set inside of Restic, meaning that anyone that has a key will have destructive and administrative access to your backup. Let's take a look at Restic's documentation. Here's the documentation webpage. Let's go ahead and go over some of the things that we can look at here. The way you create a Restic environment is by using the restic init command on any of the supported backends. Notice how there's multiple ones listed here, however, it can be summarized into a few categories: files, SSH, HTTP, S3 compatible protocols, and anything that can be proxied by rclone. Let's go ahead and see how you can make a backup. You use this by using the backup command, referencing the backup directory that you want. You can also pass in the repository as either an option or as an environment variable. Throughout the tutorial, we are going to be using the option method. However, if you are using something like systemd timers, you can use what's called an environment file to pass in environment variables for that command. Let's see how you do a quick restore before we start our presentation. The way you do this is by running the restore and then the snapshot ID and then providing the location for the restore. There's also another way to reference your backups that we will go into in the tutorial. Let's take a look at our workshop environment. What I'm currently using is a directory inside of my documents folder that represents both a backup repository and a desktop. Let's go ahead and take a look into the fake desktop folder. Here we have some files for an example. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our backup folder. There's nothing in here yet. Let's go ahead and start by creating a directory. Let's go ahead and run a restic init -r and then reference our backup folder. This is going to then ask us for a password. Do not forget the password. If you forget this password, your backups will be inaccessible. I'm going to do something simple like test. Now that our repository has been created, let's take a look to see what it looks like. That's a lot. Let's look at it bit by bit. Here we have the encrypted config directory. as well as some other folders for organization. Data stores the actual data that has been chunked. Indexes stores the indexes for file trees that reference these blocks. And then keys are where your authentication keys and encryption keys are stored. Locks are where file locks happen when another Restic process is doing a very large destructive task, and other Restic clients then know not to do anything and how to prevent the mistake from happening. We also have these snapshots, which are the topmost reference, and they're really made for us meatbags that prefer things in date and time. The backup data folder is for organizing the hashed values of those chunk datas, and you won't be interfering with this directly. In fact, the whole backup folder we won't be touching. Let's go ahead and see how to create a backup. To create a backup, we can then use the Restic backup command. Let's go ahead and make this a little more simpler for me to repeat. We're going to go ahead and back up everything inside the fake desktop folder. This is going to take all of our files, chunk them out, add it to our local cache, which is something that Restic does, and then it will upload it to our backup repository. It's also going to ask us for a password. All right, here we have a few statistics telling us what has changed. We have 3 new files, 0 changes, 0 unmodified, and we have added a total of 671 bytes to our repository. A new repository snapshot's been created with this special ID. If we run our backup again, we will see that we have 3 unmodified files and no new bytes have been added to the repository. We now have a new snapshot ID. Let's change a file and then see what happens. Let's go ahead and create another backup and see what happens. We can see that we have 1 change file, 2 unmodified, and we have added 651 bytes to the new repository. Let's go ahead and see how this has modified a repository over time. To see the snapshots in your repository, we need to use the Restic Snapshots command. This will output a table containing the ID, time, host, tags that we have, and then the path of that backup. You can also reference all of these individually by ID. So for example, what if we want to know the difference between our first and last backups? To do this, we can then use the diff command with the parameters of the 2 snapshot IDs we want to reference. Here we can see what has changed. The fake desktop/test file was modified between the 2 snapshots. If you want to see the difference between the first and second backup snapshots, we can do this. No files have been changed in this snapshot, so there's no difference. This means that this snapshot only has metadata and no actual data. What happens if we add a new file? Let's go ahead and perform a new backup. We can see that there is now 1 more new file. And if we check our snapshot history, we now have 4 snapshots. You may have noticed that there are items called tags. Let's take a look at this. Tags are special metadata that you can add to help identify backups. I personally use 2 separate tags. Keep and auto. When you are performing a backup, you can add in a parameter called tags or tag, and then the name of that tag. You can then use any name you want. For example, I use the keep tag for reasons we'll look at later. I also use the auto tag for reasons we will then go over later. This allows you to identify backups in ways that may not be easily understood with the default interface. We see that we now have one keep and one auto tag. Now let's say we want to be able to perform a restore. There's multiple ways to do this, and we'll go over these now. The easiest way to do a restore is by using the Restic mount. When you take your repository and you look at it, you can see that there are multiple snapshots that exist at one time. Let's say we want to reference a specific snapshot. Now, actually, you don't have to reference the snapshot directly. We can do this inside of the mount command. What has happened is that we now have a fuse mount. This is a file system in user space for your Restic repository. Let's see what this contains. Inside we have the host, ID, snapshot, and tags folders. If you have multiple hosts backing up to your repository, you can differentiate between them in the host folder. If you want to reference the individual snapshots by their IDs, you can use the IDs folder. If you want to reference special tags, you can use the tags folder. If you want to reference the snapshots across all of your systems, they are in the snapshots folder. Another cool way you can use this mount is, let's say you want to use a command like find. You can then take find and then your parameters and then point it at your Restic mount. You can then see what time these snapshots were created for those files. This may help you find files, but there are native ways in Restic to do it. So if you have a large backup repository or one available over a network connection, this may take some time. We can then copy and paste any of the files outside of this folder. This is essentially acting like a read-only file system. And you can manually copy out any items that you require. To unmount, go ahead and exit everything out of those folders, and then you can Control-C on your original window. If anything remains, you can just clear out the entire folder and you should be fine. Another way that we could do restores is by using the Restic restore command. This will allow us to take a snapshot that you want to reference and then perform the restore automatically for that one snapshot. Give it a snapshot name and then a target. And what will happen is that we will take the entire contents of that backup and then send it to that restore target. You'll notice that it starts at the top of your directory tree. There are some special things that you can do with Restic that I won't cover quickly in this tutorial, but I will reference. When you're doing backups, you can then use the stdin flag to allow you to pipe file contents directly into Restic over the standard input in your terminal. Some of examples of this might be piping out something from MySQL or any other thing that you don't want to store directly on disk before putting it into your backup repository. You can do the reverse of this by using the Restic dump command. This will take the contents of that backup and then export it over your standard out. You could reference any of the files in your Restic repository with dump and then export it through Restic dump. So for example, Do note that you will probably need to reference the full path. This is good if you have files you don't want to save directly to your file system, but want to import into another program. Let's talk about how to create new repository keys. If we go ahead and take our backup repository and then list out the keys that are currently installed, we can see that there is one key, the one that we created when we started this repository. Let's say we want to add a key for some purpose. The way you can do this is with the Restic key add, and then enter. It's going to then ask you for a password. If we check our keys, we can see that there are two keys. Do remember, Restic has no permissions or roles. Anyone with a key will have administrative and destructive control over your Restic repository. Some of your snapshots may no longer need to exist. Let's go ahead and reference our current snapshots and elaborate. Imagine you are doing these backups consistently over a long period of time. There are probably some that you don't really care about anymore. For example, most of these snapshots are actually the same data, so we probably will want to clear them out over time. The way you do this is by using the restic forget command. What you can do is you can pass in the snapshot ID, and it will cause Restic to forget about that snapshot entry. But this is something you'll probably want to automate. Let's go ahead and create a bunch of backups so that we have a large set of backups to work with. We now have a very large amount of snapshots for the same data. We may not want these to exist. We can emulate a snapshot policy by using the forget command with tags. For example, you can use tags such as keep tag, keep last, keep dailies, monthlies. All the way up to years. What this will do is this will scan over all the snapshots per host and keep the tags that we have specified, such as one a day, week, and month. If we go ahead and run this now, yeah, so that's what's going on. We can see that the snapshots have been deemed not both useful and not useful. For example, the snapshots we kept are 3's 4 for the following reasons. This one has the tag keep, so we kept it. This is the last 3 snapshots, which they also count as the dailies, because they are all taken on the same day. all other snapshots have been forgotten. This helps keep it clean so that you can organize better off by what you have, as well as clean over time. However, it is important to know that Restic doesn't automatically remove data when you do the forget command. This is similar to a file system where deleting a file actually removes the reference to the file, but not the actual data on the disk. You can remove the actual data itself by running the Restic prune command. What this will do is this will reference every single one of our bytes and bits in our data folder, and then remove any ones that have not been referenced by an index. What this means is that Restic will only remove data when we do the prune command. This does take some time based on how large your backup repository is. It generally will take the same amount of time as a full restore will. For example, this one was rather quick. However, on my personal system, I have about 400 to 600 gigabytes of data, and it took me for the first time pruning after 6 months about 6, 7 hours to do a total prune. You can reduce the time for this by doing prunes more often, but it's going to be a really good idea to just kind of do once a month for your prunes. Another thing that you could do if you need to rebuild your index is by using the rebuild index command. This will do the same thing prune does after it removes your data, except it only recreates indexes. It doesn't delete data. This is good if some sort of error happens and you need to rebuild your index. Let's go over some of the other commands. If you want information about your Restic repository, you can use the stats command. This will give us some information about your snapshot, but will take some time to process. Remember, this is entirely client-side. Now let's say you want to automate your backups. There are two ways that you can automate this: systemd timers and cron tabs. I personally use cron tabs, and I'll go ahead and show you mine as an example. On the first line, I am performing hourly backups throughout the day. I perform a backup on the entirety of my home directory, reference my local SAN server as a repository, and then use a password file, which is just a file with my password in that I use a special key for automation, and if it fails, it notifies me. My next command is to forget. This happens on the bottom of the hour, goes to the policy that I created, and helps keep all my snapshots cleaned up. On the 15th of every month, I do the backup prunes. I first send a notification to myself so that I know this is happening, and that it will go ahead and do the prune. This usually takes about 2-3 hours now that I'm doing it monthly. And then all of my backups will fail, but I am notified once it's done and complete. If you want to use systemd timers, there's a few commands that I can help show you to do things very easily. You can use systemctl --user space --edit space --full space --override or full, one of those two. And then that will automatically create your systemd timer for you. Well, it creates the file for you. You still have to put in the parameters, and that goes beyond what I'm going to show you today. But it's a lot more flexible, and you can do really cool things like dependencies. For example, only do backups if there's a network connection. And it's a lot more flexible than cron tabs could ever be. I do recommend diving into this if this is something that you would be interested. It's a lot more flexible. This also could be done per user or system-wide. It's your choice. It's how you can configure systemd. It's pretty flexible. That is going to be everything for the tutorial today. If you found anything interesting, please let me know. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know as well. I do recommend looking into the documentation of Restic further. I only skimmed the surface, and there's a lot of other really cool things you can do. Thank you, and goodbye.